this summer, where people in warmer climates in the United States were going indoors, we saw real spikes of infections down in the Southeast in the warmer climes. Now those spikes have gone away. And the vectors of transmission have really moved up to the colder climates where people are coming back indoors and being in heated spaces. And so we're seeing real spikes in Alaska, Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, and Colorado. So let's just keep each other safe. I see we've just joined our live stream. So let's get this show on the road. We're going to have a great discussion, and please do contribute questions. They really help, and they keep the discussion lively and informed. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we're chatting about loss, grief, and bereavement with special guests. Vicki J., CEO of the Texas-based National Alliance for Children's Grief. Lauren Schneider, Clinical Director of Child and Adolescent Programs at Our House Grief Support Center in Southern California. And Bev Warnock, National Executive Director of Parents of Murdered Children that is based in Ohio. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we'll take 3 snap polls during the show, and we'll announce results. And questions submitted to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So this is so important to discuss, and I am so appreciative that you've all made the time to talk about a difficult topic, but a topic that really affects us all. It affects us all at some point in our lives. A death of a loved one is so very traumatic, especially when the situation is unexpected or violent. And today's social media saturated world can amplify the trauma that we feel. It can remind us when we're trying to process, can re-traumatize, and grief. It's such a shared experience, yet so individual from person to person. So your services have to reflect both of those realities. So Vicki, I'd like to start with you. Could you tell us about your mission over the National Alliance for Children's Grief?
Thank you, Mark. Absolutely. But first, I really want to thank you and your group for bringing the topic to the table. So many times people don't want to talk about it. It is, as you said, the most universal topic, but yet it's sometimes the hardest one to talk about. So thanks for this opportunity. The NACG, the National Alliance for Children's Grief, exists ultimately to ensure that no child grieves alone. And translated, what that really means is that we strive to raise the awareness about all kinds of issues related to childhood grief and loss. And we work really hard to equip those that have the opportunity to work directly with children and teens. First and foremost, we want people to understand that kids do grieve. And as simple as that sounds, it's not always understood. Maybe we recognize it, but we really don't want to deal with it. So sometimes it gets pushed a little bit to the back burner. Not only do they grieve, they need our support through their grief process. And you mentioned this, but each child's grief journey and loss and experience is very unique, as well as their response to it. But they all deserve, we think, they all deserve the community of people who are equipped to walk with them, beside them through their grief experience.
You know, it's so interesting because grief and the source of grief can be seemingly mundane or obviously traumatic, right? When a parent goes away, and maybe on a trip, right? The child is suddenly bereft of that parent. That's a small little example. And then when a grandparent or a parent passes, you have this enormous event. Lauren, how do you see the constellation of experiences that lead to grief within the context of your programs?
Really depends on the age of the child, Mark. And the circumstances of the death, that each griever is so unique. So we have to, we look at each person that walks through our doors in such an individual way. And I'm thinking of some current examples that are new, new ways that people are grieving because of having been in isolation last year and now suddenly back in school and having to relearn how to socialize and do that when they're in the midst of grieving, or grieving a death due to COVID, where they feel guilty and worried that the family is blaming them because they're the ones who brought the COVID into the home. These are some of the new things that we're having to learn. But we look at each child and teen in a very, very individualized way.
And so you're raising a really important point. The whole idea is that during the pandemic, grief had to unfold in a fundamentally different way, and you had to adjust, your staffs had to adjust, and families needed to figure out. We had some losses in our family, and distance, trans-Pacific, transatlantic distances made things so very difficult.
Yeah.
We had visits where we couldn't actually see the person in hospital. And what do you do? What do you do? You just sort of process. Bev, your organization takes it to another level, because we're talking about the loss in families of children who are murdered. Could you talk a little bit about how your organization came about and how you serve your constituents?
Okay, our organization started in 1978 when a Cincinnati couple, their daughter was murdered in Germany by the ex-boyfriend. When coming back to the States, they couldn't function, so they had to find some way to begin a new life. Grief with murder is a little different because it's violent, and it happens suddenly. You don't have time to say goodbye. They're sick, or in an accident. Just a little bit is somewhat different than with grief with murder with our families. And our mission is to try to help the families cope with the grief. We have a national conference so they can come together to bond with other families. It helps them to be in support groups. We have over 40 chapters all over the United States to get together, of course, now by Zoom. It's their way to reconstruct their life. It's before the murder, after the murder. They feel like they have a contagious disease. A lot of people will stay away from them because they think it will happen to them. And murder happens to everybody. It doesn't matter, where they live, who they're with, it happens, and it's something they have to deal with. They're thrown into the justice system that they have no idea how to handle. And so that is our mission, is to help them with all the things that come with the aftermath of murder. And we actually do not deal with children. All of our family, they have to be over 18. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a child. It could be a sibling. It could be a grandchild. Anyone can, be part of our organization if they've had someone murdered, coworker, friend, anyone.
What strikes me about your organizations and this moment in particular, this moment of grieving, is that in other areas, if you have homelessness, there is a tendency to blame the person who is homeless. If you have poverty, there's a tendency to blame the person who is impoverished, right? There is no, in terms of grief, there is no blame, right? All you have is the person where they are and meeting them where they are. In many respects, it seems that you can be a model for how we function as a society. Would any of you care to comment in terms of the diversity of people who come in through your doors and how you meet them, and how you basically function in terms of your intake, the first contact that you have? Vicki, why don't you start? When somebody comes in, who is that person? How old are they? What is their race, their income, or does it not it just doesn't matter?
A couple of thoughts, and then I'm actually going to defer to Lauren because she does this in a more direct way than I do. Our organization is the connector. So we try to connect people to their local support organizations and programs. But what I would say is that individuals, we serve children, usually school-age children, so usually 4 to 18 to 21, depending on the programs. But they come with all that they are in their past. They bring their family, their culture, their traditions, their history of loss, their experiences to this current situation that causes them to seek help or support.
So the people who are coming to your alliance members, they are male, female, different orientations, different identities,
all of the
different
above,
races, different economic. Everybody is just a person in grief.
They are. And another thing, Mark, I'd point out is that you mentioned early that there's a lot of different things that cause loss and types of loss and sudden and unexpected. And Bev's talking about the very unexpected. And we really work hard with our kids not to compare loss, because for them, it's their loss. And that's the most important, horrific loss they can imagine. So it doesn't matter if it was, quote unquote, just, an expected older grandparent or a very unexpected sibling. To them, it's the loss of somebody they loved and cared about. And it's as important as anybody else's loss. So,
and culturally appropriate services is also important, because
absolutely,
where people come from, right, their lived experience and the support that they might have from somebody who knows their experience, that's also part of what your group
absolutely.
is about.
And Beth mentioned it, and Lauren and I in our programs, peer support is huge, because they don't want to be the only ones. Whether you're a child or an adult, you want to be with other people who understand that, they're not the only ones. I don't want to be the only one that is in this world that this death has caused. So peer support is just such an impactful tool across all of the programming that we do.
So Lauren, I got a question from Jolyn Walker. She said, are there any times when young adults, 16 to 18 years old, look for your services on their own? How do they come to an organization like yours, since you serve children and adolescents?
High school age children is what the question was. We do occasionally have a call from a teenager. Usually it is initiated by their school counselor that makes them aware of our resource, and they'll place the call themselves. And we do try and involve their grown-up in the intake process that we do with each family. Vicki mentioned that we do support groups. Most of the members of the National Alliance for Children's Grief are not mental health centers. We do what we call grief support, which is a support group often facilitated by volunteers. So that with that 16 or 17-year-old, we would try and include their grown-up, because what we know, one of the things that we do know to be very, very true, because there's a lot of things that aren't true about grief, but one thing that is very true is that the conditions in their caregiving environment are very important to how that person is going to adjust to their life without the person who died. So we really want to know whether that their grown-up is supportive of them getting the grief support services the teen wants. And in fact, I will always try and get the adult into our adult program as well, because we have a separate adult program for any adult, whether they have a child or not, at our agency in Los Angeles.
So we just completed a poll in which we had 91% of the people responding, so that they had experienced the types of losses that we're talking about today. Bev, in terms of people coming in, they've come in after a violent act. Could you talk a little bit about that experience? Because what in your particular case, as you said, unplanned for, unexpected, violent, impossible to process in the moment. Could you just give us a sense of if that happens to a friend of ours, what are they going through, and how we can encounter them, and how we can in some way be supportive? If you could give the example of how people come into you and their transformation over the first stages.
Sure. Our office is located in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we are national. So we don't really actually have people come into our office, but they call, email. And yes, if it was a friend, we can tell them to listen to them, talk to them, help them as much as you can, maybe get them to attend a support group, attend with them. The main thing is listening to them. People get tired of listening to their story, after they tell it time after time. Could be 5 years down the road and they're still grieving, just because of, the type of death. Unfortunately, now domestic violence is just really on the rise. So, it could be their daughter was murdered by the husband, and then they have grandchildren to raise. I mean, it adds all kinds of new things to their life. And, that's a difficult thing to do. But, the main thing that we tell if someone calls and they're calling for someone else is to be able to listen to them and let them talk, let them grieve. One of the hardest things, and we've heard this quite often, is men and women grieve different. And men sometimes tend to not grieve. They try to hold it all in, which is extremely, bad for them, because that usually develops physical problems later in their life if they hold that in. You need to grieve. We call it the journey of grief. You need to go on that journey. You need to get it out. You need to be able to talk about it to whoever you can. If your family doesn't listen to you anymore, that's when friends come in, or a support group helps immensely.
We used to have the attitude in this country that there was a separation between mind, emotion, body, and so on. Bev, do you feel like there's more of a connection, and we're recognizing that connection? You talked about holding it in and having that sort of backup on you physically. Do you think that there's really this sort of holistic connection between how we feel, how we think, how we act, our physical selves?
Yes, I do. I think after you've had a murder in your family, you don't know how to act. You can't feel. You're in shock for, a long time. So it really changes your personality, your way of life, your functioning capabilities. So yes, it does. It changes your whole life, with the murder. And we sometimes say, it is different than just a death of a grandparent, because they have so many questions. They don't know why it happened. And sometimes those questions can't get answered. If the murderer commits suicide, or, whatever happens, they can't get those questions answered. And that is one of the hardest things for our families, is not knowing why, not knowing, what happened. And then they also have the guilt. Why did I let them go out that night? This wouldn't have happened if they went out. Or why did I, let them do whatever happened to, for the murder to happen? And the guilt is sometimes, the worst thing for them. And it's hard to, get them through the guilt of why it happened.
We just completed a poll. Vicki, I'm going to come to you with a question based on it. We asked, what do you think are the 3 most useful ways to cope with grief? And those areas that got the most support was accepting support from friends and family. And then we had sort of avoiding destructive habits and creating structure around grief through prayer, ritual, and so on and so forth. In terms of the services that your folks provide, Vicki, how do you look at this? Are there certain sort of themes? In this particular case, the feedback was creating structure around grief and ritual, through prayer or whatever the ritual might be, avoiding destructive habits, family support. Are there particular, if you look at all the services that are provided, are there particular categories that seem to be particularly powerful in your field?
You know, as you were talking about with Bev, we recognize that it is the whole child that experiences the loss, and we try to have programs and tools that reach each part of that child. So, you know, children express grief very differently, and what is helpful to them is a little bit different than might be what's helpful to those of us on this call as adults. So, you know, just because a child is playing doesn't mean that they're not grieving. Play is often their tool. So the tools that we use and resources involve movement and music and expressive arts, as well as things in community, as well as things in solidarity where you're alone. You know, I think one of the things that we need to know is that to be able to recognize a person as a griever is the number one thing. Schools, for instance, it affects a child's performance, academic performance. But many times school teachers assume that child is just acting out or not able to keep up or distracted because of who they are, without looking that one step deeper to say, you know, really what's behind that is a recent loss in that child's life. And so we really try to address, it's not just what happens in the peer group, which is probably our best, you know, modality to reach kids, but it's what happens in all parts of their life. How do they interact socially? Has their role changed at home? They're no longer a big sister. They're no longer, you know, a child. How has that changed? So it's across all of them as a whole person. I'm not sure I answered your question exactly.
Oh, you answered it fine. I wanted to ask Lauren, as a clinical director, I have a kind of a complicated question to ask. If you look at dealing with grief, there are all sorts of different elements that you've all mentioned. There's the idea of confronting grief, but also diverting from it, not becoming obsessed in a cycle of looking at grief. So there's diversion and there's also focus, right? There's physical activity, there's also rest, right? There are a lot of different approaches that seem to be just sort of really different from each other. And it seems that part of what we have to do is navigate a future that integrates this experience for us in a way that is positive. So as a clinical director, you don't want anyone to go to an extreme of just constant diversion and not dealing. On the other hand, you don't want people to go to obsession. How do you look at a clinical approach that helps people to find their own balance, that allows them to explore and not sort of have a paternalistic medical kind of approach? This is the right formula for you. How do you navigate that between the expertise that you might have, but also respecting that each person has to find their own path?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm still kind of reflecting on the previous question, though, too, with what Vicki said in the answers to the poll, that I do feel like one thing that was really missing from their response to that poll was how important the peer group is, because the family, although the adult in the family may say, let's keep this in the family, culturally, that's often the case. The child may not feel comfortable expressing themselves to the adult in the family because they don't want to make them more sad. So we get them away into a room without their adult present, or even without their siblings sometimes if they're different ages. And then they have the freedom to express themselves without worrying about how it impacts their adult. So for your viewers, that's why these peer groups, we also run a grief camp. We're part of the Camp Aaron network. The camp or the grief group at school, whether it's at school or a center like our house, is so important that for the child to have their own safe space to express whatever they need to do. You know, and then Vicki has the resources to help people find that all over the country, has the list. So back to your other question, though.
Well, I just wanted to say, we've gotten a number of comments saying, just sort of thanking you for covering that. We did ask the question, that was interesting. We did ask about support from peers who are not part of the family. Nobody answered that, but you're saying it's a very important piece.
Yeah, because especially teens, they always tell us that their friends aren't there for them anymore. They almost always say after the first couple weeks, the friends, they feel abandoned by their peer group and more isolated than is comfortable for them. And they need a new peer group to identify with as a teenager that is a positive peer group. We don't want them to find a peer group out of that need for identity that is not a positive peer group. And sometimes we've seen that happen if they don't join an Our House group or another grief support group. But
so on the clinical question in terms of clinical judgment.
So we do, like most centers, follow a specific model that's a nonlinear model, and we address certain goals with anybody who participates in the program. Goals to help them, with their thoughts, with their feelings, adjust to their life without the person who died, but also maintain the bond with that person who died. We're not telling them to forget about them and get over it. We want them to maintain that connection, especially because most of the time it's a positive in their life. So we're always working on these goals, but not in a linear way. So like last week, we were doing Dia de los Muertos projects, whether that was the person's culture or not, because that's a perfect holiday observance for all grieving children and teens to honor the memory of their own loved ones who died in this very colorful, upbeat way. So we're working on that particular goal that we have in our treatment goals. Versus another week where we might focus more on feelings. Plus, last thing, and then I'll be quiet, we also teach them coping strategies from mindfulness, breathing techniques, and all those things to address what you were saying earlier, to help them with that mind-body connection, to calm themselves when they experience big feelings or you can't focus in class.
Bev, I'm mindful of what Lauren is saying, and also if you look at the life of our president, Biden, who suffered loss through an accident and then through the death of his son by cancer. There's a sequence. He talks about the fact that at a certain point you can refer to the loss, the loved one that has been lost, with a smile, but there's a sequence that you have to go through, and Lauren was just referring to it. Could you just help us to understand that sequence, that where we can be supportive of someone who has suffered such a traumatic loss?
Sure. There's different stages of grief, your beginning stages, where you're in shock and traumatized, and the pain does soften. We also say it never goes away, but it does soften. And, eventually you can just remember the good memories that you had of your loved one. And that helps you get through the time, the anniversary of their death, their birthday, special holidays. The memories are, the best thing that you have to, concentrate on for the day. And then you start to relive the memories, and you can maybe laugh and start to enjoy life, after your time. Everybody, the time, you can't put a time on your grief. Everybody grieves different in different times, different ways. So, it just depends.
So, and we also see the memorialization of people who have been lost through the development of different initiatives. Sometimes they're very small initiatives, sometimes they're very large, each of them equally significant in their own ways. How do you help adults and children create some sort of a memorial that marks the significance of their loved one?
Except for me, we have a murder wall that families can put their loved one's name on, and every year we take that murder wall to our national conference that's held in different parts of the United States. Next year it'll be in St. Louis, 2022. And we, honor the murder wall, honor the loved ones that are on there. And that's how they can, they can come and they can also honor and memorialize their loved one by our murder wall.
We've talked a lot about death, and we did get a prompt from one of our viewers asking about grief that is not associated with loss through the death of a loved one. Vicki, could you talk a little bit about what you've experienced, particularly during this COVID time, that is about grief, that is about loss, but isn't necessarily associated with the death of a loved one?
I think in this last, 18 months or so, we as a nation are grieving unified more than ever before. We perceive that we've lost a lot, both real and perceived. But during this time, particularly, loss is real prevalent in our thinking. And there's not the typical support systems in place. So you mentioned, even Mark, in your personal family, you've had some losses, and there were additional challenges because of COVID with distancing and lack of contact and all that. And that definitely has played into death loss. But everything that plays into death loss also plays into other losses. I think for our organizations, the three represented, we all focus on loss due to death, but we are also very cognizant that there are a lot of losses that happen in our life. And, from a child's experiencing deployment and incarceration and divorce, all those things are losses in that child's life. And so very many of the tools that we implement and the thoughts and understandings we have about children in grief as well as adults in grief, it doesn't really matter the cause of loss. Some of the same things, permeate across all losses.
So we just completed another poll, and we're coming to the end of our time. We're going to go to you, Lauren, and then we're going to wind up with you, Bev. Bev will have the last word. The poll was, have any of the following ever stopped you from seeking help and support when struggling with the death of someone close? And we found that there's a denial, there's a fear of being vulnerable. That's a big, big, big issue. I mean, it basically 55% of respondents answered in that way. And then the whole idea that grief is too personal to share. Couldn't talk with my family, didn't know what to expect, didn't know what to do, was kind of frozen. All those were part of this. But one of our members actually prompted this question. We have attitudes. Suicide is a sin. Those kinds of issues. Lauren, could you talk about barriers and how we can help our friends, our families, ourselves overcome those barriers? Because we do sometimes, we're human beings, we sometimes have need. How do we process those issues? If we are deeply religious in a way that processes suicide as a sin, how do we deal with that?
That's a really tough one, because we may not ever get access to that particular child if the family has that stringent of belief about it and about seeking support outside the family or outside of the church, let's say. We have a way of helping children understand suicide as the result of a medical problem, of an illness. And we help the children come to terms with it that way, that their person died due to a disease, whether it's a disease related to substance abuse or a disease related to a mental health problem. And that helps the children. It takes the stigma out of it that the family is being impacted by in their community possibly, but and then the child also feels that they fit in with other people in their peer group, in their grief group, who also had loved ones die due to medical conditions. And almost overwhelmingly, suicides are due to a medical condition of either the two sorts that I mentioned.
So
Mark,
there's nothing there that would be against any type of religious practice is what you're suggesting, Lauren. I'm sorry, Vicki, go ahead.
I just had a thought that I can't help but share. We've learned from our survivors so much that the media doesn't help with that sometimes, because we all use, and it's habit, but we all use the word commit. And commit means usually related to a sin or a crime. So if we can just change our languaging around suicide to say they died by suicide, death by suicide, took their own life, just other words that kind of take that negative connotation of commit out of the conversation, it helps our families so much.
So basically what you're suggesting is not in contravention to any belief system. What you're basically suggesting is that we should just look at the survivors, try to treat them with respect and empathy, and not try and stigmatize, or try to not stigmatize, and just accept, embrace, support.
Right, and kids often don't embrace the beliefs of the adults in their family. They're grieving that adult, whether or not they might have a relative who believes from the religious perspective. I just don't hear that suicide is a sin anymore. That went away probably 20 years ago, I think, when I first started doing the work. I don't hear that from the families that actually show up. But yeah, I'll stop with that.
We're going to give you
going all day.
We're going to give you the last word because one of the things that really strikes me is that we, through our social media, are far more exposed to these events that used to be isolated and covered only in the local press. And now we instantly have access. So we have not only do people experience the personal trauma of loss, particularly when someone is murdered, but we all become part of that experience in many respects. So now we all have a responsibility to help in the healing. What can we all do to help in that, guys? What can I do tomorrow to be a better person in that respect?
If I'll speak, I'll say you've already started the conversation. You know, just putting the conversation on the table and letting people talk about death and dying and all those things related to it, making it a conversation that is easy versus one that is, not comfortable. And then in our case, we have tons of tools on our website, how to talk to a child about death, how to explain a funeral, how to have those conversations. Look for resources. If you're grieving, unfortunately, have had a loss in your own life, don't be afraid to ask somebody for help. Let somebody know you need help. And if you're all the rest of us who are lucky right now that we're not grieving a death at this moment, then, look for ways to help others. And the resources that are available both on Bev's and ours are usually free. We're here to serve. We're here to equip everybody to have the tools and the conversations and the resources we need. The investment we make now in each other creates healthy communities down the road. So I just want to say thank you, Mark, for putting this topic on the table.
Lauren, would you endorse that whole idea of just sort of coming together that Vicki?
Yeah, Vicki said it so well, and earlier Beth also added the importance of just listening, because friends and family can't fix it for other people. There isn't like magic words to say, but just listening, being present, checking in with people, and just being there with them for as long as they need. It doesn't go away after a month, you know. So I think that was very helpful when Bev mentioned that. So I want to reinforce that. Just listen.
Yes, and I agree with that. We have families say that their friends stop talking to them because they don't want to hear about their grief, or they don't want to watch them cry. You know, what kind of friend is that? That won't help them to, you know, or let them cry and talk about their loved one. But we hear that all the time.
Listen, let's just be there for each other.
Right.
Vicki J., CEO of the Texas-based National Alliance for Children's Grief, Lauren Schneider, the Clinical Director of Children and Adolescent Programs at Our House Grief Support Center in Southern California, and Bev Warnock, National Executive Director of Parents of Murdered Children based in Ohio. Thank you so much for sharing the experiences from around the country. And there's so much, we have so much in common in this country. We can actually learn from each other, share, collaborate. It's wonderful, wonderful that you're here. We will post links to your website on the YouTube and other video posts. Tina, you just asked, and we'll make sure that that's done. Thank you, attendees, for asking all your great questions. And please all thank your staffs, thank your donors, thank your communities, thank the people, the volunteers who have experienced grief themselves and are helping others to process. Thanks so much, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.